Welcome to this seminar where we will discuss the aftershock of war in Ukraine and how it has affected women and girls around the globe. It's Plan International and International Rescue Committee who is organizing this seminar. And that is two organizations that focus a lot on support to women and girls in conflict settings and crisis settings. And it's actually the fourth time that we have this a seminar on this focus here in Almedalen. And we will probably continue until we feel that women and girls are getting the right support. So, my name is Monica Lorentzon and I will moderate this seminar together with
Sofia Klemming Nordenskjöld from International Rescue Committee in Sweden. And with us today on stage, we have this esteemed panel, starting with my colleague, Arlem Desir, Senior Vice President Europe for International Rescue Committee. Warm welcome.
Well, thank you. Good morning.
And we have Karin Jämtin, Director General for SIDA. Warm welcome again, fourth time.
Thank you very much.
And we also have Anne Paulsen, who is leading the World Food Programme's Nordic office in Copenhagen. Welcome.
Thanks.
And Paulina Schaber from the Folke Bernadotte Institute. And you're an expert in, let me see the right title here. Security Sector Governance Expert from Folke Bernadotte Academy.
Thank you.
Warm welcome to everyone. Before we head on, we will just go through the seminar. During the next 45 minutes, our aim is to get a deeper understanding of the age and gender dimensions of crisis and conflict. We will learn how the war in Ukraine affects other crises all around the world and what this means for women and girls. And we will also talk about the links between investment and in women and girls and lasting peace and security. And finally, discuss the solutions. What is needed to improve the situation for women and girls?
And one more before we start the discussion, we will also want to set the scene a bit to sort of describe the situation for women and girls, because it was not like, I mean, girls and women were facing a lot of challenges even before the war in Ukraine started. So, first of all, and we've heard this before, today there are more than 100 million refugees worldwide. 60% are women and girls. We also have a severe hunger crisis that Anne will talk more about later on, but more than 800 million people are affected by this, and again, 60% women and girls. We also have a big problem with gender-based violence, and sometimes sexual gender-based violence. And here I will take the opportunity to mention a report series that Plan International has produced called Girls in Crisis, and it could be found on our website. And we have talked to thousands of girls in crisis all over the world, and they are all facing the same challenges. They talk about not being able to go to school. They're talking about how their movements are restricted. They're talking about the fact that nobody is listening to them. But most of all, they're talking about fear of violence. And it's not only fear of violence from armed men, but also from within the families. Because in times of crisis, this situation becomes worse and worse. And the UN Secretary General have even called gender-based violence a shadow pandemic. And we see how this is increasing all over the world. And we also see more child marriages and those kind of things. So that is one of the things that girls are really suffering from. We also have the effects of climate change. Floods, droughts, wildfires, and it affects hunger situation, and it affects risks of more people become refugees. And the economic downturn. In times of economic crisis, not only international development assistance goes down, but also remittances. People are not sending home money to the same extent as before. And you also see less direct foreign investments. risk is that this creates chaos. And we've seen countries that has sort of been forced back in crisis. Sri Lanka is one example. It wasn't a country that was on the move, but when the food prices and the fuel prices rised, you saw again civil unrest. So that is sort of the not so very positive situation that girls face around the world. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Monica, for setting the scene. And we will now start off the panel. And first, I would like to ask you, Paulina Schaber. You work for Folke Bernadotte Academy, an expert agency that, among other things, specializes in women, peace and security. We would like you to start off by asking in what way women and girls are affected by conflict differently than boys and men, the gender dimensions of conflict.
Sure. So I think, as we just heard, the consequences of war are numerous, and some impacts and consequences are the same for women and men. So, for example, lack of shelter, lack of physical security, and so on. But some security concerns are gender-specific. Not only security concerns are specific, but also the needs and the experiences and the priorities during conflict, but also after. So, on a more general level, we know that men are more likely to be drafted to armed groups and therefore more likely to be killed in direct combat, whereas women are more likely to suffer, like we just heard, from sexual and domestic violence. Women are also more likely to face displacement, as we just heard, and we've seen this now more than ever in the war of Ukraine, where men are required to stay behind and women and children are fleeing the country. We also know that life in displacement comes with other risks and challenges. For example, gender-based violence is increasing in displacement and so on. So, in short, we can say that men's security risks and threats during conflict tend to be more direct, whereas women's security needs and concerns tend to be more indirect and therefore receive a lot less immediate attention. Sexual and domestic violence, for example, is in many cultures considered as a private matter and not for public debate. So many women choose not to go and report these cases to the police because of the fear of stigma, also fear of not receiving emergency support and so on. So I think this is one of the key sort of differences between how women and men are facing war and the consequences. Another, I think, important aspect is that women and women's organizations are often extremely important in humanitarian crisis and, of course, in general in society. But women are largely absent from negotiation processes and peace processes. And this is also one of the key differences, because people with power and resources in a broader sense, are usually the ones that get a seat at the table. And usually this is not women. I also think, just lastly, it's important to point out that obviously not all women or all men have the same security needs, but other factors such as age and ethnicity and social class, economic status, and so on, intersect with these needs and priorities and experiences. And it's about constantly asking the question, how is this affecting women, men, boys, and girls? And is this a result that we want? And if it's not, then we need to respond to that.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
So next question goes to Arlem. Your organization works in more than 40 humanitarian crises across the globe. What have you seen now after the war in Ukraine? How have you seen the effects on women and girls, and what about the aftershocks that we're talking about?
Thank you for the question, Monica. What we have seen is first that in places where there were already food insecurity, the rise in the prices of food and energy has made it even more difficult for population to have access to food. So there is more displacement of population and more fragility in a lot of communities. Women and girls are always a majority among the displaced people and the refugees, so they are more affected. When families are up to the point where they will begin to sell any of their belongings, at a point also we see more children working. We see more marriage of young girls. We see so more risk for women and girls. In some places, it's also linked to the fact that with the displacement of population, you need also to work to a remote place to get access to some food or to some water. So there's issues of protection. In a whole, what we see it in the Horn of Africa, we see it in Yemen, we see it in the Sahel, we see it in Afghanistan, is women and girls who are the first victims of this degradation of the humanitarian situation, who are more exposed to violence, more exposed also to sexual abuse, including inside their own communities and sometimes in families. So the impact, yes, is very strong, is very hard. And on the other side, we also know by experience that you need to build the response by working more with empowering women and girls in the way you provide assistance, you provide aid, so that they can be part to the stabilization of the community and also to contributing to building peace. And also that in any aid and assistance program, by ensuring the role and the direct involvement of women-led organization, you ensure that there is more possibility to develop protection for women and for countering gender-based violence and any kind of abuse against women.
Thank you. Anne, World Food Programme, do you see similar effects, and could you tell us a little bit about what you see from your end?
Sure. I mean, most recently in Ukraine, of course, there was a report by CARE International and UN Women that already in May stated that women were more affected as to food security than men are in Ukraine, with almost 40%, 4 out of 10 women being affected increasingly by food insecurity. So I think we there see this how shocks like wars, conflicts, COVID-19 hit women disproportionately. Yeah, something like that. Yeah. So we've seen that in Ukraine, but we've seen it all around the world as well, that in conflicts as well in other crisis situations, it's always women who eat last and they eat least food. And now, as you mentioned in the beginning, with the war in Ukraine affecting not just the Black Sea region, but the entire world in terms of driving up food prices and driving up to alarming numbers the number of hungry people in the world, that is again affecting women and girls more than men and boys. And as you mentioned, 60% of those who go hungry are women and girls. And so the fact that shocks are not gender neutral, that manifests already when, in childhood, boys are those who get to be served first. They get most food. If a family has to take out, if they cannot longer afford to both send their children to school and also feed them, it's typically the girls who are taken out of school and to help in the household or to other negative coping mechanisms such as early marriage. That is what we see in the countries that we operate in, and we in more than 80 countries across the world. And I think I better stop here, but I have an example I'd like to mention at a later stage.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Karin, like we said in the beginning, it's not the first time we stand here and discuss this issue, and unfortunately, this situation hasn't improved. Rather, the opposite. When you hear your fellow panelists discussing here, what are your reactions, and in what way can SIDA respond?
We can respond upon in many ways, but I would like to start off by saying that yes, my reaction is of course that I recognize what you are describing, and we can unfortunately see it in I was about to say more every country that we work, but more or less in most of the countries that we work, we can see that women eat last, girls don't go to school, and many things that my fellow panelists here are describing, we are meeting in nearly all of the countries where we work. But I would like to actually add one challenge that has not been mentioned. And that is that we are just coming out of the COVID crisis, and the COVID crisis in itself hit women and girls harder than men and boys. Girls were kept to a larger extent from school. They had less accessibility to digital tools of different kinds. Women are more often working in the informal sector, and the informal sector were harder hit by the COVID situation, by them not being able to go out, work, sell, or do whatever they are doing on gender neutral. And one sort of has to put on these glasses when deciding what to do and recognize that there are groups that are really forgotten about at times. I would like to add one more number. And last year we did a global multidimensional poverty analysis. There are many interesting figures in that, but one got stuck in my mind, and that is 5% of the world's population approximately belongs to an indigenous group, but 15% of the poorest in the world belongs to an indigenous group. Imagine then being a girl or a woman in an indigenous group. Then you really need support to get forward.
Thank you, Karin, and thank you also for mentioning the pandemic. We see that I think it's about 11 million girls that risk not coming back to school when they open again, and 13 million girls are at risk to be married off, more than it would have been otherwise up until 2030. So thank you so much for mentioning that. I would like to just a quick question to all of you, because we've all, everyone here has been mentioning that girls or women are hit the hardest. But why do you think, just a quick question, do you think that the humanitarian principles that sort of states that you should help people based on aid and on needs and needs only, not your identity, could that in some way stand in the way for the specific intervention that girls and women are in need of? What do you say about that? Arlem?
Well, I think helping women and girls means that you recognize that they are more affected by crisis, that they are the majority of the affected population, even if there is also some specific security concern for men who are enrolled in an armed group. But I mean, when we speak about displaced population, refugees population whose life is shattered, of course, it's men and women, but there is a majority of the victims, or the most affected people are women. So insisting on the feminist approach, I would say, of international aid as of diplomacy in general, is also recognizing this and then helping to focus on some specifics which could otherwise be not identified. I very much support what has been said about the fact that some of these violence are not are hidden. They are in family environment or in close community environment. So we think that it's very important, even in kind of programs which are for whole a population, like an agriculture development program. We tried to do this, for example, in Central African Republic, in a place I've been visiting near Bangui last year, to also add to this support to grow a cattle, by a community, to have also a program to ensure that women can have access to a safe space and can say there is violence in the neighborhood, in my family, and I want to be able to report it, and then you can deal with this issue within the community. Because if you don't precisely target that kind of situation, you will never see it.
Any others that would like to add to this?
This is maybe where I may come in with my example. I think, in World Food Programme, actually, a majority of the people we serve are women, and that's also because of the societal structures where women are, in many countries, the breadwinners. And I think when this gender discrepancy dawned on me was when I was first sent or deployed for the World Food Programme. My first job was in Haiti, and I didn't know about these things. I was a journalist before, and we are blessed with our ignorance, you know. So I didn't know, but I went to a city up north and to a health clinic. And I went there with a Danish journalist. I took her to report about the social situation in Haiti, which was really, really dire at the time. It was in 2004, so many years ago. But still, this was kind of the breaking point for me when I realized that we were talking to this woman. She had had 5 children. 2 of them had already died from malnutrition. And another one she took to the health clinic because her 5-year-old girl had turned blind for the fact that she did not have access to basic vitamin A, which eventually will turn you blind, and next stage is actually death. And so the journalist was also interested in the political situation. There was an election, a presidential election coming up, and the journalist, after asking questions to her family and her children, asked more political questions like, so a presidential election is coming up, and what do you think about that, and what do you think about the situation? And she went blank, not because I don't think she was not interested in politics, but when your entire life as a breadwinner, as a woman, is focused on getting the next meal on the table, not just for yourself, but for your children, you don't have the luxury of engaging in you know, family matters, local community matters, even national matters. They're so far out of reach because every hour awake is about getting the next meal on the table. So women are affected. I'll see if I can do it disproportionately. You know, in these situations, this was Haiti, but we see that across the world where, and that's why you had that discrepancy, and that's why you need to put the gender lens on humanitarian action as food assistance.
Thank you.
Yeah. Karin, yeah.
To me, the humanitarian principles would help us actually support and prioritize women and girls, as they are often the ones most in need. So the humanitarian principles are really something to hold on to when prioritizing the ones most in need. But we also know, so I'm very positive around them, but what we also know is that any kind of gender work needs facts and figures, meaning that we would have to have, if there are no statistics and facts and figures, then often women and girls are forgotten. So we need to combine humanitarian principles with facts and figures.
Do you want to add something, Paulina?
Quickly add on to that, and maybe a little bit about what you said, Anne. I think that this is also about, you know, realizing that gender equality needs to take form where norms are created, where decisions are being made, where power is being shared, and so on. And this is not the case today. Women's experiences and needs and priorities, like we just said, you know, are largely left out. And we see this, you know, as much today with the war in Ukraine as, you know, hundreds of years of conflict before that. So I think one key thing here is to really keep pushing for making sure that women are granted access to decision-making at all levels, not just to participate because they're women or, you know, being conditioned to participate, to contribute with a certain perspective of being a woman, but just because it's a basic human right to shape the society that you live in.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we've seen that there is a lot happening in the world, and at the same time we see that ODA goes down, and the Swedish ODA as an official development assistance. And the Swedish government has recently decided to cover for domestic refugee costs with the ODA budget. But they've said that they will continue to concentrate and not cut down on the humanitarian assistance. How do you see the risk that this leads to even more crisis? And we'll start with you, Karin.
If it was only the Swedish government, sorry, Swedish government. No,
not only Swedish government.
No, if it was only, then there would be no crisis. But there are many governments doing the same kind of priorities, meaning that humanitarian aid is often growing and long-term development cooperation being a little bit diminished or a smaller budget. And that will lead to, in the long run, not maybe this year, but in some years to come, more difficulties in trying to prevent crises by working with education, health, so cash transfer systems, climate, all of these extremely important areas that we have to handle to avoid humanitarian situations to occur. Thus, it's dangerous is a strong word, but it's at least very problematic with the situation that you are describing.
We would like you, Anne, Paulina, and Arlem to comment on this as well. What risks do you see when aid is diverted from many humanitarian settings, even though the needs are larger than ever? Who would like to start? Anne?
Well, I mean, every krona and euro or every dollar and cent is, of course, translated into life saved. Of course, that's how it is. So we are extremely worried that just to see this trend, fortunately, we have not been affected. The humanitarian side of it has not been affected. And I want to, if I may, acknowledge Sweden for being a top donor to the World Food Programme and a donor of flexible funding as well, and remain to be so. But of course, it has consequences. And the really depressing thing is that all the gains, the development gains we've seen that has been built up over years, that has been built up because we were able to reduce hunger throughout decades. I mean, all that is being reversed now. Since 2016, the number of hungry people started to increase again, and that was due to conflicts, protracted conflicts, to climate change and to COVID-19, and then further exacerbated by the conflict in Ukraine now. So we see number of hungry people be skyrocketing, and that again has huge effects on women and girls. But the fact that governments keep on supporting us and we plea for increased funding, will help us to ensure that these development gains are not eroded, that the access we have been able to secure women to education through our school meals program, to building assets through our food for work programs, and providing them with financial opportunities and access to political decision-making bodies. That is really something that on the long run is reducing the gender disparity, and where investment in that long haul is really crucial, not just to save lives, but also really to change lives in the long run.
Paulina, do you want to comment on the risks for diverting ODA?
Sure. I think perhaps a little bit from a different perspective, but I mean, this is not an isolated issue, right? It interplays largely with conflict, for example. In Somalia, where the war in Ukraine has caused increased prices in livestock and gas, in combination with the worst drought for many, many years, has forced even more, refugee flows across the country. And one of the main reasons, especially women, are in displacement in Somalia is because of water scarcity. So I think we need to look at these issues sort of and how they add on together. And we know that climate changes and climate security is kind of like a threat multiplier. It increases food insecurity. It increases competition over land, water scarcity, and so on. So I think it's important to sort of keep focus on the more long-term consequences of war and conflict, and to keep supporting access to political participation, access to education, access to healthcare, and so on. And it is going to be important, I think, for the international community to kind of keep a sort of, eyes on the prize and not forget about the sort of long-term processes that are key for women and girls' lasting peace and security.
Thank you. Arlem, do you want to comment?
No, I agree with what colleague says. It will mean more people suffering. It's clear that in most of the places where we see the highest risk now for food insecurity, for example, it's places where we were already, before the war in Ukraine, facing droughts, consecutive years of droughts, which is linked to climate change. We saw protracted conflict, which are more difficult to solve because it's both international and internal conflicts, more difficult for the UN to get peace agreements. The UN is very much blocked by the abuse of the veto right. There's a kind of age of impunity where armed groups are attacking health facilities, humanitarian workers, civilians, state failure in many places, not only by the fact that states are not able to provide health or education or food to their population, but because they contribute sometimes to isolate part of the population from this access to services and so on. If you add to this a reduction in the assistance in places where we have rebuilt with local community more resilience, where we have begun to work on the agriculture program to more adaptation to climate change, when we have built access to water, access to vaccination and so on, you just destroyed any kind of possibility of stability. And we are speaking about the role. I think we should speak more about also the success, about the result of what we are doing. And we are very much open to more accountability, to checking the outcome, to parliament, citizens, the press, looking at what is the impact of the kind of development aid or humanitarian aid and assistance that we are delivering. There is impact, there is result. And I don't think that we should have to choose between dealing with the consequences of the war in Ukraine and our duty to welcome refugees, to bring assistance to the people inside Ukraine and in Poland and in other European countries like my country, France or Sweden. I mean, this is a duty of our continent for which we have to dedicate the necessary means. By the way, there was a conference this week in Switzerland about the future needs for the reconstruction of Ukraine. And I think the Prime Minister of Ukraine speak about $750 billion. I mean, we will not deal with this by taking the money which is needed in Ethiopia, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Mali, to help women, girls, and the population to face the increase of food prices and to avoid to die of starvation this year. Those has to be two things we have to deal with together, because we are trying to build a more secure world. So with support to those who are victims of a war in Europe, and trying to enforce the respect of sovereignty and integrity of a European state, but also promoting the respect of the Charter of the United Nations in all of these dimensions in other parts of the world, and being part of the same humanity, helping those who suffer from climate change effect, for example, and the increase of price of food because of a war in another continent, our continent. And they are the victim of this. And we have to be there on their side and to continue the work we have been doing in the past years.
Thank you, Harlem. And good also to talk about positive signs and results, because that was we felt we're painting a rather gloomy picture here about millions of women and girls that are threatened by increased poverty and hunger and violence and child marriage and what know I. So we will now spend the remainder of this seminar to talk about solutions, what works, what needs to be done. So thank you for helping us to cross that bridge a bit.
Yeah, so Arlem, would you like to start according to the IRC's experience? What do you see as solutions? What works well, and what would you like to see more of from Sweden and other donors? And would you like to share any best practices from us?
Well, first, I wish that Sweden will continue with this Swedish feminist diplomacy, leading by example, and other countries have been following on this path, and it's very important. We see. I would just mention shortly three things. First, investing in women protection is very important to enable women's participation in peace building and economic reconstruction. You need to provide security, safety to women if you want them to be more able to engage in the community life. Secondly, health is a key issue. Here there is an urgence. I mean, the access to health services is very difficult, particularly sexual and reproductive health. And so what works is to provide the access to these services, and you can really change the mortality risk, for example, for women when having children. Thirdly, education and women economic empowerment are vital, of course, for improving livelihood and financial stability. In terms of sometimes economic support, you know that we very often start by cash distribution, which is a way to ensure that family will have access to food, that markets will work again. We must ensure that women directly have access to this cash distribution so that they are empowered also in their family, in their community. That kind of very concrete things have very concrete results.
Thank you. Karin, in what way is Sweden's feminist foreign policy addressing the problems that we have discussed? And could you like to share with us a little bit what works well and where is it room for improvement?
In many ways, we are guided by, as Anna mentioned, the feminist foreign policy, and thus we are trying to put a lens, a gender lens or a feminist lens on more or less everything. But I would like to start off by mentioning maybe two concrete things. The one is that we give support to UN Women's statistics work, which is very important not only for UN Women, but for all United Nations agencies, but also other donors and countries to actually get the facts right. Where are women working? Where are girls going to school? What is missing? What is not missing? Etc. etc. So it's a small contribution, but I find it. I think it's very, very important for catalyzing other things. The other area that is also a small contribution, but I hope will make a difference, is our work and support to the generation equality on exactly women's economic empowerment. As this is a broad work on getting women's to get an income that they can decide on, etc., in different ways, in different countries, in different areas. They are both small interventions, but very catalytic. And then we work in all of the areas that was mentioned before, sexual and reproductive health and rights, health systems, etc. Education, we discussed the other day, but we do some work in education, but we focus more on health from the Swedish side. But then I think one important area which is growing and that will continue to grow is cash transfer to women-headed households. In many countries. I myself had the possibility of visiting a household in Addis Ababa, a very poor. The mother had died from AIDS, actually. There were two girls living with their aunt, and she got cash transfer, and the girls had the possibility to go to school. They were extremely poor. I don't actually exactly remember what the aunt lived from, but she had some kind of work on the informal sector. So these kinds of interventions will grow from our side in the years to come. I could continue for long, but I will not. Time flies.
Thank you.
Paulina, you work with peace and security. What is needed to create durable solutions, lasting peace and security that also works well for women and girls?
I think, first of all, I want to second what Karin said. I think it's extremely important. The kind of first step is that we need to know about the security needs and priorities of women, men, boys, and girls. If we rely too much on stereotypes, we really risk, shooting behind the goal. I don't know if that's a saying in English. Anyway, I think that's really the first step to make a gender analysis. And I think we need to make a gender analysis of the situation, and we need all programs and interventions to be gender mainstream, but we also need more gender-specific interventions that really target women and girls' security and peace. And I think, again, as I've been saying, I think it's really important to keep focusing on these more long-term processes, like constitution processes, reconciliation processes, election processes, and so on. Because, democracy is ultimately going to protect all social groups, women and men included. And I think we need to keep pushing for these in conflict-affected countries where we see these processes hampering, and we see that women are largely absent from them. We need to continue to sort of push for that. And from FBA's side, we work with, for example, election processes. In Somalia, we've been working with the federal, but also the subnational election to promoting women's participation, both from a security perspective, working with police and security actors on how to mitigate and prevent violence against women in election and politics, but also how to sort of provide guidelines on principles of gender quotas and so on. So it's a kind of more technical and capacity building support that FBA does in relation to these questions.
Thank you, Paulina. And what you said about participation is very, very important. That is also something we work with from the side of Plan International, to start this meaningful participation from an early age, just as to have the age dimension there. Because as I said before with these Girls in Crisis reports, they feel, many of the girls feel that nobody's listening to them and nobody is sort of hearing their voices. So thank you for that. Anne, solutions on the hunger crisis?
Well, do I have another hour or?
Unfortunately,
4 minutes.
No, it's fine. I think
if you can fix that in an hour, I'm sure we could negotiate that.
yeah, let's try. Let's have a go at. I think, Karen, you talked about UN Women, your contribution to UN Women, and to create the statistics, and I think that's really crucial. The understanding that we have the knowledge, we have the evidence, that we have the intelligence to really understand how we can be agents of change through our assistance rather than doing harm. And we've had in the World Food Programme this idea for many years that we would, through food security, contribute to prospects for peace. But of course, we didn't have the solid evidence that this was the case. And then we entered in a research collaboration with CIPRI, the Swedish International Peace Research Institute, to help us document where food assistance and food security actually could contribute to pathways of peace. And they have come to visit our country operations. World Food Programme is in more than 80 countries across the world. We have this deep field presence. We have the deeper understanding of the structures of the mechanisms, but we wanted CIPRI to help us understand exactly how food security could contribute to these things. And the conclusion is we are now in the second phase of the research collaboration, looking into also aspects about gender, about climate. Measurement is really important as well. How do we measure the dividend? But the conclusion is overall, yes, food security can build pathways to peace. And I think, if I may, the Nobel Peace Prize in 2020 was actually a recognition of the importance of food security. I think we see that now with the crisis in Ukraine, that if we are not safe until all are safe, sorry for the cliche, but that's a fact, how a crisis in the Black Sea region can have ripple effects all across the globe. For the solutions, I think there are many, and luckily we are many partners to work across the board. You mentioned cash-based transfers. Actually, one of the examples that CIPRI did look into was in Nigeria, where women were given cash to go buy their own humanitarian food assistance. We use more and more cash in World Food Programme. 40% of our aid is actually cash-based, and where that gave them much more decision power, and they were actually able to sometimes leave a relationship that were harmful, and they prevented them for having a fuller contribution to local society. School meals is really important as well. Paving the way for girls to not only come to school, learn better because they're given the nutrition that they need to thrive and learn, but also making sure that they stay in school by giving incentives to the family to keep them there. So, yeah, so these are some of the areas where we work. But I think very, very important is the deep understanding of the mechanisms in this, and evidence is therefore crucial.
Well, time flies. It's soon time for us to leave the stage, but we want to thank you all, panelists, for coming here. A warm thank you for you for contributing to this seminar.
And welcome back next year.
Yeah, and welcome back next year, definitely. And a warm thank you to you in the audience. Thank you for coming, and thank you for watching this seminar.
Thank you. And just a quickie. Jag skulle göra lite reklam. Både